The ship's warning klaxon blared in Ken's ears, tearing through the heavy silence of the cockpit. Red emergency lights flickered, casting a crimson hue over the worn-out controls of his research vessel. Star Weaver. His hands moved instinctively, punching buttons, desperately trying to stabilize the ship as it barreled through space toward the unknown. The console flickered before him, flashing system failure and atmospheric entry imminent in bold red letters. The Star Weaver was falling fast, the ship groaning as it shook violently from the strain of broken systems. "Come on," Ken muttered under his breath, trying to force the failing systems to cooperate. He glanced at the readouts. The primary engine was offline, secondary systems were compromised, and the automated AI gave a calm yet eerily unhelpful report: survival probability low. As the ship screamed toward the surface of an unmapped, uncharted planet, Ken braced himself. Below, through the viewport, the sight of a vibrant world, awash in deep purples and electric blues, filled his view. The planet Irza. This wasn't even close to where he had planned to land. The emergency protocols had clearly failed him. Ken tightened his grip on the controls, feeling a surge of anxiety as the ship lurched and bucked beneath him. Sweat beaded on his forehead. This is it, he thought. He wasn't sure whether he'd make it out alive. Atmo entry in 10 seconds. The AI droned, and Ken heard the cold, mechanical hum of the landing thrusters struggling to engage. He punched in a manual override, sweat soaking his palms as the temperature readings on the console spiked. Hull integrity warning flashed. The ship's metal frame screeched in protest. Through the viewport, the atmosphere of the planet began to tear at the hull like a monstrous hand. A blinding flash of light. The ship was entering the atmosphere. Red-hot air blistered against the craft's exterior, threatening to reduce it to ashes. "Brace for impact," Ken yelled, not sure whether he was yelling at the ship, himself, or the unseen forces about to crush him. In a final, desperate move, he yanked the controls hard, aiming the Star Weaver toward a narrow break in the dense forest canopy. The ground was rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed. The ship's descent felt like an eternity, each second filled with dread. Thud. The world exploded into chaos. Metal screamed against Earth, the ship slamming into the alien soil with bone-crushing force. Ken's safety harness dug into his shoulders as the ship tore through the ground, plowing a deep furrow in the terrain. When the impact finally stopped, the world was a blur. A pounding headache swarmed Ken's vision, and he struggled to clear his thoughts. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He slowly unbuckled his harness, but it felt like his body was made of lead. The stench of burned metal and smoke filled the air. His head spun. When he opened his eyes, he blinked in disbelief. The forest surrounding him, it was glowing. Bioluminescent lights pulsed through the vegetation, casting eerie blue and green waves through the trees and moss-covered ground. The very earth seemed to breathe with life, as though the planet itself was alive, responding to his crash landing. "This isn't possible," Ken murmured under his breath, forcing his legs to move despite the dizziness still clouding his mind. His scanner was still operational, and as he activated it, the readings flooded in, showing unprecedented data on the electromagnetic sensitivity of the local flora. The plants, they were alive, responding to the environment in ways that shouldn't be possible. Atmosphere is compatible with human life. The AI report sounded surprisingly calm, given the chaos surrounding him. But one thing caught his attention, and it made his heart skip a beat: unknown biological agents detected. Recommendation: sealed environment suit. Ken didn't need further encouragement. He grabbed his emergency suit, sealing it around his body with shaky hands, the gravity of his situation hitting him fully. This wasn't just a crash landing, it was something much more dangerous. The door opened with a hiss, and the moment Ken stepped outside, the forest light seemed to intensify, as though it was responding to his presence. His boots sank into the soft, mossy earth, and as his foot made contact, strange purple light rippled out beneath him, like the forest was alive and reacting to his every movement. This wasn't the planet he had signed up for. The sensation was incredible, awe-inspiring, but Ken wasn't in the mood for awe. He needed to survive. He needed to find a way to fix his ship and get off this planet before whatever strange things lurked in the woods made him their next meal. As he scanned the surroundings, trying to make sense of the bioluminescent chaos, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure, humanoid in shape, darted between the trees. His pulse raced as his hand instinctively went to his side, where his pulse pistol was holstered. "Hello?" Ken called out, his voice steady despite the rising panic. "I mean no harm. My ship was damaged. I had to make an emergency landing." The forest held its breath. Then she stepped into view. Ken froze. She was tall, easily as tall as him, if not more. Her skin was the color of a twilight sky, deep and rich with a touch of something almost otherworldly. Sharp, predatory features framed her face. And her hair, it wasn't hair at all. It looked like living vines, twisting and shifting with a mind of their own. But it was her eyes that held him, made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. They burned with an inner fire, a flame that seemed to reflect the very energy of this strange planet. The trees behind her darkened, their colors shifting to angry reds and oranges as if they were reacting to her presence. Ken's scanner went haywire, its readings spiking off the charts. The woman took a step forward, her movements graceful, yet there was an undeniable threat in the way she carried herself. She raised one hand, and the ground beneath Ken's feet erupted with thorny vines, wrapping around his legs with frightening speed. He stumbled back, trying to break free, but the more he struggled, the tighter they grew. "Whoa, hey, let's talk about this," Ken yelped, trying to stay calm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to repair my ship and get out of your territory." "Kingdom, whatever this is." The forest fell silent, even the bioluminescent glow seemed to still, as if holding its breath, waiting for her response. The woman's gaze didn't leave Ken as she spoke. "You think to consume my essence with your sweet words and strange weapons?" Ken blinked, completely taken aback. Consume? What was she talking about? He looked at her, and his voice softened as he slowly reached for his emergency food pack. No, I'm not here to consume anything. Unless you count my bad taste in space rations." Her expression darkened, the vines in her hair seeming to writhe with an intensity that matched the growing tension in the air. "You crashed here deliberately," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Ken shook his head quickly, trying to explain. "Trust me, nothing about that landing was deliberate. My ship malfunctioned, systems failed. I barely avoided becoming a crater." The tension hung heavy between them. Finally, after a long moment, the woman relaxed her posture. "I am Reena," she said, her eyes still fiery but with a hint of something else, something softer. "You will remain under my watch while you repair your vessel. Any attempt to harvest power from our world or its people will result in your immediate execution." Ken let out a sigh of relief, not realizing until then how tightly he had been holding his breath. "Ken," he said, trying to offer a smile, "and I promise, the only thing I'll be harvesting is whatever spare parts one can find from my ship's backup systems." Reena's expression softened, but only slightly. The vines in her hair relaxed, and the surrounding forest seemed to calm as well. But Ken couldn't shake the feeling that things were just beginning to get very complicated. The first hours after the crash were a blur of activity and exhaustion. The forest around Ken's ship, the Star Weaver, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The glowing trees casting an eerie light on the wreckage. Every step he took felt like he was in some sort of dream. A strange reality where nothing made sense, even with the ship's engines down and half of the systems disabled. His mind raced, piecing together what little he understood. Ken knew the basics. He was stranded on an unknown planet, with no clear way of contacting anyone. He needed to fix his ship, gather whatever resources he could, and stay alive long enough to figure out a plan. What he didn't expect, though, was how complicated survival would be on a planet where the forest itself seemed alive, aware, and very much in control. "Ken," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Reena, standing just outside the range of his ship's light, her eyes glowing with an intensity that made the forest lights pale in comparison. She was watching him, always watching. Ken wasn't sure whether she was there to help or simply to keep an eye on him until he could get the hell off her planet. "Yeah?" Ken replied, turning to face her, not bothering to hide the weariness in his voice. He was tired, but there was no time to rest. The Star Weaver was a mess, and he had no idea how long he would have before the planet's wildlife started getting curious. "Your ship," she said, tilting her head slightly. "It will not last here long. The plants," she glanced around at the glowing trees, "they will feast on its energy if we don't make it more secure." Ken frowned, confusion creeping into his features. "Feast? What do you mean, feast? You are not the only one who survives on energy." "Ken," Reena replied, her voice cold yet strangely patient, as though explaining something obvious. "These woods, this planet, it feeds on life. It thrives off energy. And right now, your ship is a light, a beacon. If we don't hide it better, it will attract more than curiosity." Ken's pulse quickened. Was she implying that the plants would attack the ship? That they were alive? Before he could respond, Reena turned, moving with a predator's grace. Her figure disappeared into the shadows of the glowing forest, leaving Ken no choice but to follow. He hesitated for a moment, but he was out of options. If she knew more about this planet than he did, he had to rely on her. As they trekked deeper into the forest, the alien landscape unfolded around Ken in strange, dazzling ways. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the moss-like plants reacting to his every step, glowing brighter or dimming depending on his movements. Every so often, the plants would release pulses of energy, like tiny sparks dancing through the air, as if the world itself was alive and aware of him. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the faint rustling of the trees and the distant hum of some unseen creature. Ken found himself lost in thought, trying to understand just what kind of planet he had landed on. The forest, no, the entire ecosystem, was like nothing he had ever encountered. The bioluminescence, the way the plants reacted to emotions, the subtle hum in the air that he swore he could feel in his chest. How is this even possible? Ken murmured, more to himself than to Reena. Reena's voice, low and steady, broke through his reverie. This world was shaped by forces you cannot understand. The people who came here before, they tried to change it, to use it, and now, this is what it has become. Her voice hardened slightly. We were changed, too. Ken's mind raced, the pieces slowly falling into place. He wasn't just dealing with an alien world that was dangerous. He was dealing with a planet that had been altered in ways that defied his understanding of biology, technology, and nature itself. They arrived at a clearing, and Ken could finally see it. The Star Weaver, now parked in the middle of a natural amphitheater formed by towering trees, their branches spreading high above. The glow of the plants had dimmed here, but the ominous feeling remained. The ship, now clearly out of place against the vibrant, living landscape, seemed vulnerable. Reena stood next to him, her posture alert. "We need to hide it," she said. "The plants will come for it soon. But we have other dangers to worry about." Ken nodded, watching as the plants near the ship seemed to twitch in response to the proximity of his vessel, sending out faint pulses of light. He wasn't sure what he was seeing, but there was something undeniably unsettling about it. "What exactly do you mean by, they'll come for it?" he asked, swallowing the growing knot of unease in his stomach. "What kind of plants are we talking about here?" "The plants here, they do not simply grow. They feed," she explained. "They feed off energy, life. Your ship is an energy source, and they are drawn to it." Ken stared at her, trying to wrap his mind around what she was saying. "You're telling me your plants are alive? And they eat power? Is that even possible?" Reena's gaze softened for a moment, as though trying to gauge whether he could understand the gravity of the situation. "Yes, the ecosystem here is symbiotic, but that also means it's dangerous. You cannot take from it without consequences. If you try to harvest resources from this world, it will fight back." Ken's mind whirled. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, but everything she said was too plausible. The energy around him, the hum in the air, the way the plants responded to his presence, it all made sense now. In a terrifying way. "What do we do?" he asked. Resigned, Reena's face hardened, a warrior's resolve taking over. "We secure the ship. We keep the energy from leaking out. I will show you how." For the next few hours, Ken worked under Reena's direction, securing the Star Weaver as best as he could. The strange plants in the forest seemed to follow their every move, pulsating with a strange rhythm. The air was thick with tension. But Ken noticed something odd. He no longer felt quite as uneasy around Reena. In fact, there was a strange sort of comfort in her presence. Despite the obvious danger, Ken found himself oddly drawn to her. There was something about her, a strength, a quiet power, that made him feel strangely protected. Yet, there was also an undercurrent of something more between them. The moments when their hands brushed while working on the ship, the fleeting glances that seemed to carry unspoken thoughts, all pointed to something growing, something deeper, but they were both too focused on the task at hand to address it directly. As the evening wore on, Ken realized that they had forged an unspoken understanding between them. Reena wasn't just an alien warrior, she was someone who had endured, fought, and survived just like him. She wasn't the enemy, she was an ally, a guide in this alien world. By the time they finished securing the ship and the forest around them had settled, Ken knew that he owed her more than just his survival. He owed her his trust. "Thank you," he said quietly as they both stood near the ship, the last of the sunlight fading from the sky, leaving the bioluminescent glow to take over. Reena gave him a quick, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes still glowing with the intensity of the forest. "Trust is earned, Ken, but you have done your part. I will keep my word. As long as you respect this world, you will remain safe." Ken looked at her, seeing something new in her eyes. A quiet respect had begun to form, not just between them, but within him for this warrior, this stranger from another world. Maybe, just maybe, this planet held more than just danger. Maybe it held answers, and perhaps, along the way, there would be more to discover than just survival. The days on Irza began to stretch out like the endless skies above, each one blending into the next. Ken's mind was consumed by the task of repairing the Star Weaver. But he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something far bigger was unfolding here. It wasn't just the ship, or even the planet, that was alien. It was everything about this place. The forest, the creatures, and most importantly, Reena. Her presence was ever constant. And with each passing moment, Ken found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. The forest had been eerily quiet for a while, as though it, too, was waiting for something. Ken had grown accustomed to the strange, rhythmic pulsations of the trees and the almost sentient way the plants responded to their emotions. And yet, there was always something more, just out of reach, some deeper layer to this world, and to Reena, that he hadn't yet uncovered. On the third evening, as they stood outside the ship, watching the sunset ignite the sky with impossible colors, Reena spoke for the first time in days. "You should know," she said, her voice low but steady, "that there are those among my people who do not trust you. They believe your kind will take from us, like those who came before." Ken turned to her, sensing the heaviness in her words. "What do you mean, those who came before?" Reena's eyes flickered with something distant, a memory that seemed both painful and ancient. Before the change, Irza was different. It was a world of balance, until the outsiders came. They came with their weapons and their machines, their promises of a better future. And they tried to consume us. They wanted to take what we had, to use our power for their own. They wanted to make us, like them. Ken's heart clenched. He could see the scars of that history in Reena's eyes, in the tense set of her shoulders. What had happened here? He thought of his own world, with its history of conquest and colonization, and a sinking feeling washed over him. Was this really where they were headed? "I'm not here to take anything from you," Ken said softly, his voice steady. "I just want to learn, to understand. There's so much about your planet, your people, that I don't get." Reena met his gaze, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke again. "Understanding comes with trust, and trust, it's something we have lost." The words hung heavy in the air between them, but something else lingered there too, a spark of something, unspoken, subtle, but undeniably real. The next morning, Ken was startled to find Reena waiting for him by the wreckage of the Star Weaver. There was an unusual intensity in her presence, and her eyes held a fire he hadn't seen before. "You will need to prove yourself, Ken," she said, her voice firm, almost stern. "You are not the first outsider to land here, and those who came before you, they were dealt with." Ken frowned. What do you mean? Dealt with? They tried to take from us. She repeated, her tone hard. They tried to take our power, to consume it for themselves. And when they failed, they were destroyed. Ken swallowed, his mind racing. And I'm supposed to prove I'm different by, what? Fixing my ship and leaving? No, Reena said, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. Not just that, you must pass the trials. Trials? Ken asked, confused. What kind of trials? Reena's smile faded, replaced by an expression that bordered on dangerous. The trials of the forest. The trials of my people. If you wish to prove yourself, to earn our trust, you must survive them, and only then will we see if you are truly different. Ken's heart raced. This wasn't just about repairing a ship anymore. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever was coming next. But he knew one thing for sure. He had no choice but to face it. The first trial came sooner than expected. That night, as the stars lit the sky in their strange, violet hue, Reena led Ken through the winding paths of the forest. The air was thick with the hum of unseen creatures, the trees stretching tall above them like ancient sentinels. The forest will test you, she said, her voice as calm as the night around them. It will test your strength, your spirit, your ability to survive here. And if you fail, her eyes darkened, the forest will take what it needs. Ken glanced around, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He had been ready to deal with a broken ship, a dangerous planet, and the prospect of being stranded on an alien world. But this was something else entirely. Don't worry, Ken, Reena said, her voice almost teasing as she glanced at him. The trials will be difficult. Yes, but they will also show you the truth about yourself. And about this world. She led him to a clearing in the woods, where the glow of the bioluminescent plants cast an eerie light over the scene. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, glowing with an otherworldly energy. This is the heart of Irza, Reena explained, her gaze softening slightly. It is where the first trial begins. Ken stepped forward, his body tense, feeling a strange pull from the tree. As his fingers brushed against the bark, the world around him seemed to shudder. A deep rumble rose from the ground, and suddenly, the earth beneath his feet cracked open. Vines erupted from the soil, twisting and coiling around his legs, pulling him downward with terrifying strength. Ken's heart pounded as he fought against the plant's grip. But the harder he struggled, the tighter they became. He reached for his pulse pistol, but his movements were sluggish. The vines were everywhere, wrapping around his torso, his arms, threatening to pull him into the earth itself. Ken, Reena's voice pierced through the chaos. Don't fight it, let the forest read you. Surrender. Ken struggled to breathe as the vines tightened their hold, their strength far beyond anything he had encountered. But Reena's voice cut through his panic. A steady, calming presence. He forced himself to relax, to still his thoughts, to surrender. Slowly, as though responding to his surrender, the vines began to loosen. The pressure on his chest and legs eased, and he was left standing, gasping for air in the center of the clearing. The ground beneath him rumbled once more. But this time, it was different. The earth shifted, and the tree in front of him seemed to pulse with light. Responding to the change in him, Reena stood by his side, her eyes unreadable. You did not resist. That is the first lesson. The forest seeks harmony, not struggle. Ken's breath was still ragged, his body aching from the ordeal. But something had changed. He didn't understand it fully. But the world around him, the forest, the very essence of Irza, had accepted him. The energy in the air was different now, lighter, almost alive in a way he could feel in his bones. This is only the beginning, Reena said, her voice soft but resolute. There are many more trials to come, and only by facing them will you understand the truth of this world, and of yourself. Ken wiped the sweat from his brow, still trying to process everything that had just happened. He had faced the forest's challenge, and somehow, he had survived. But what was the next trial? And what would it reveal about him? And about the strange world he had crashed on? As they made their way back to the ship, Ken couldn't help but feel a sense of unease mixed with awe. The trials were far from over. But in that moment, as Reena walked beside him, her presence grounding him, Ken couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something far greater than he had ever anticipated. The sky over Irza had darkened by the time Ken and Reena made their way to a secluded part of the forest. Far from the ship, the trees towered over them, their bioluminescent leaves flickering with an eerie pulse. The air was heavy with the weight of something unsaid, something that had been building between them since that first moment they'd met. Ken felt it, this magnetic pull between them, as if the very planet was conspiring to bring their fates together. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something else was at play here. Something far greater than their personal attraction to one another. Reena had been distant since the first trial. She had been focused, calculating, her every move designed to test him, to gauge whether he was worthy of her trust. The trials, she explained, were not just for survival, they were a test of spirit, strength, and commitment. But now, as the moonlight filtered through the trees, there was something different in her eyes, something softer, more vulnerable. "You're not the only one being tested," Reena said, her voice low, almost wistful, as she led Ken deeper into the forest. "These trials are as much for me as they are for you." Ken glanced at her, his curiosity piqued. He had thought of the trials as something he had to prove to her people, to earn their respect and trust. But now, the realization hit him that the stakes were far higher than that. They were a reflection of something deeper between him and Reena, a bond that was beginning to form. But one that was fragile, one that could be shattered with a single misstep. "You're asking me to prove myself," Ken said carefully, choosing his words with care. "But I've already told you, I'm not here to harm anyone. I'm just trying to survive, and to learn about your world. But I'm beginning to think I'm learning something more than that." Reena stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. The night around them seemed to grow quieter, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The pulsing light from the bioluminescent plants illuminated her features, highlighting the intensity in her eyes. "Survival isn't enough, Ken," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of emotion. "I've seen what your kind is capable of, and what you want to take. I've seen the destruction, the way you consume and exploit. So you have to prove yourself. Not to me, not just to me, but to this planet. To Irza itself." Ken swallowed. Her words cut deeper than he expected. It was one thing to be tested by her people, but another to feel like the land itself, this living, breathing planet, was watching him, judging him. "You think I'm like them," he said softly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, one that pierced through the tension hanging in the air. Reena's gaze softened just slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Not yet, but that's the point of the trials, Ken, to see what you're truly capable of, to see if you can be trusted not to take, but to respect what Irza is. What we are." Ken felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, and it was at that moment that he understood. This wasn't just about surviving. This wasn't just about fixing his ship and leaving. It was about something deeper, a connection that went beyond simple survival. It was about belonging to this world, to Reena, and to the people of Irza. And it wasn't going to be easy. They arrived at the next trial site by nightfall. This place, unlike the peaceful, glowing clearing where the first trial took place, felt ancient, as though it had been here long before either of them. The trees were older, gnarled, their branches reaching high into the sky. The air was thick with tension, and the forest seemed alive with anticipation. "This is where the next trial begins," Reena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ken's heart thudded in his chest. What kind of test was waiting for him now? "You must enter the circle of resonance," Reena continued, her gaze now focused on the shadows around them. "This trial is one of spirit. You will face the heart of Irza itself, its will, its essence. Only those who can prove they are worthy will be allowed to pass. The forest will judge you." Ken didn't have time to think, as soon as the words left her lips. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. The bioluminescent trees flared to life, their branches twisting and pulsing as the air itself seemed to hum with energy. A glowing circle formed at the center of the clearing, its light casting an otherworldly glow. Ken stepped forward, his pulse quickening. Reena's voice was a soft command behind him. "Stand in the center," she said, "and allow yourself to be read." Ken hesitated for a moment but then stepped into the circle. The moment his foot crossed the boundary, the ground shifted again, He could feel the air grow heavy, thick with an almost tangible energy. The plants around him pulsed in time with his heart, the energy in the air syncing with his own. His breath came faster as the forest surrounded him, its living energy testing him, probing him. Do not resist. Reena's voice called out again, her tone urgent. Let it see you, let it feel your heart, your intentions. Ken closed his eyes, trying to quiet the noise in his mind. He thought of the endless space he had traveled, the crash landing, his struggle to survive. He thought of the planet, of Reena, standing behind him, watching him. What was it they were asking for? A sharp wave of energy crashed into him. He staggered back, his chest tightening as if the entire forest had wrapped its roots around his soul. His thoughts, his very essence, were being exposed. Every fear, every doubt, every inch of him was laid bare. He felt vulnerable, he felt exposed, but through it all, he also felt something else. Something deeper, something that reached into the core of him. Suddenly, there was a flicker, a warmth that spread from the ground beneath his feet, up through his legs, into his chest. It was the connection, the bond between him and Irza. A bond he hadn't realized had been growing since he first stepped foot on this planet. The energy of the forest shifted. The glow around him dimmed, then brightened once more. Ken opened his eyes. The circle around him was alive, swirling with colors that he couldn't even begin to understand. He breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of the world around him. And then, to his surprise, a soft voice broke through the silence. You are different, Reena whispered, her eyes locked with his. And for the first time, he saw something there, a flicker of something that went beyond mere duty. Beyond mere survival, there was something real between them now. Something that wasn't just about proving himself, but about the deep trust and connection they had started to build. Ken could feel it now. The love that had been blossoming slowly between them wasn't just about survival. It was about something far more profound, far more transformative. You've passed the trial, Reena said quietly, her voice full of awe. You've proved that you can belong here. But as she stepped forward, her expression hardened. But there is still more to be tested. The trials are not finished, Ken. The real test is yet to come. The days after Ken passed the Circle of Resonance trial were filled with an uneasy peace. The planet Irza itself had seemingly accepted him, and with each passing moment, Ken could feel the connection between him and the alien world grow stronger. Yet, despite his survival and the increasing awe he felt for Irza's vast, living ecosystem, there was another force at work, something that pulled at him in ways that were undeniable. It was Reena. She was no longer the detached warrior, the silent observer she once was. Now, every glance between them carried an unspoken weight. There were moments, subtle ones, that made Ken question if they were merely two individuals trying to survive or if something deeper, something far more intimate, was slowly unfolding. As Ken sat beside the Star Weaver, working on the ship's engine, he couldn't help but glance up to see Reena standing a few feet away. She was watching him, her figure outlined by the soft, shifting glow of the bioluminescent forest. The flickering lights of the trees painted her in a shimmering hue, almost as if the very forest itself had taken a breath at the sight of her. Why did she make it so hard to breathe? It was a thought Ken had been struggling to dismiss. Ever since their first encounter, he had felt drawn to her, not just because of her beauty or her strength, but because of the connection that had begun to form between them. Ken quickly refocused on his work, trying to ignore the strange flutter in his chest. The Star Weaver needed repairs, and he didn't have time for distractions. But then, there was a soft rustle from the bushes behind him. Ken, Reena's voice sliced through the quiet, startling him out of his thoughts. Her tone wasn't the cold, distant one it had once been. There was something warmer now, something more personal. Ken stood, wiping his hands on a cloth as he turned to face her. Yeah, I need you to come with me, she said, her eyes meeting his, flashing with something Ken couldn't quite place. She motioned for him to follow. There's more to show you. Something you'll need to understand if you're going to make it here. Ken hesitated, but only for a second. Despite the growing tension between them, despite the uncertainty that loomed over everything, there was something in Reena's presence, something magnetic, that he couldn't resist. He followed her without another word, the pull of her unspoken invitation stronger than any logical thought. The forest seemed to part for them as they moved deeper into the trees. The path ahead shimmered with light, as though the plants themselves were guiding them. Ken marveled at the sight. Every step felt like a dance, the very air around them alive with energy. As they ventured further, the atmosphere grew more still, more intimate. Eventually, they came to a clearing unlike any Ken had seen before. It was a place of deep serenity, where the trees stood in a perfect circle, their trunks covered with glowing markings that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of life itself. "This is the heart of Irza," Reena explained softly, her voice almost reverent. "Where the forest's energy is strongest. It is here that we bond with the land." Ken glanced around, feeling something stir in him, a strange yearning, a sense of belonging. The place was powerful, the energy unlike anything he'd felt before. It was as though the forest itself was watching him, aware of his presence, waiting for something. Reena turned to face him, her gaze locking with his. There was no mistaking it now. The walls between them, the awkwardness, the distance, had all but vanished. They stood there, facing each other, the air thick with unsaid words. "You've seen how this world connects with its people," Reena began, her voice soft, but her eyes never leaving his. "The trials were not just for you, they were for me too. To see if I could trust you. To see if you could understand what it means to live here. To belong here." Ken swallowed, his pulse quickening as he stepped closer. The moment felt electric. Every fiber of his being was drawn to her, as if the very planet conspired to bring them together. "And have I?" he asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "Have I proven myself to you?" Reena didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the gap between them. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, Ken saw something in her that went beyond the fierce warrior, the fierce protector of her world. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, something that reached into him. "You've proven yourself, Ken," she said softly, the words thick with meaning. "But there's more to it than that. This bond, it's more than just survival. It's deeper than you think." Ken's breath hitched. He could feel her presence now, her warmth, her energy, radiating through the air. It was overwhelming. The intensity of it, he could see the glow of the forest reflecting in her eyes. And for a moment, he couldn't tell where the forest ended and Reena began. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed against hers. The moment their skin met, a surge of energy shot through him, a warmth that spread from his chest down to his fingertips. It was as though the very fabric of Irza's energy had intertwined with theirs. Reena inhaled sharply, her lips parting as if she was struggling to catch her breath. Her eyes darkened, and for a moment, Ken thought she might pull away. But instead, she stepped closer, her body pressing against his. And he could feel the wild thrum of her heartbeat through the light fabric of her armor. "Reena," Ken whispered, his voice hoarse with unspoken emotions. Before he could say more, her lips crashed against his, silencing him. The kiss was fierce, urgent, full of the tension that had been building between them ever since they met. The world around them seemed to fall away. The glowing trees, the hum of the forest, the very air between them filled with an energy that mirrored their kiss. Ken's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled her closer, his hands finding her waist. The energy between them flared, the forest responding in kind, a dazzling light show erupting from the trees, illuminating their intimate moment in a shower of bioluminescent colors. Reena pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes, her breath ragged. "You don't know what you've done," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ken smiled, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "I think I have an idea." The connection between them felt undeniable now, like two souls intertwined, a bond stronger than anything Ken had ever known. But as the intensity of the moment simmered down, he realized that this wasn't just a fleeting attraction. This was something deeper, something he couldn't escape, even if he wanted to. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reena's eyes darkened with a mixture of emotions, desire, uncertainty, and something even deeper. "We take the next step. Together." But Ken knew it wouldn't be easy. No, this was just the beginning. There would be more trials, more obstacles to overcome, but with Reena by his side, he finally understood. The real challenge wasn't surviving Irza. It was surviving this connection, this love, and the powerful force that drew them together. The days following the intense kiss and the undeniable connection that had bloomed between Ken and Reena felt like a haze. The planet, once cold and indifferent, now seemed to hum with the energy of their bond. Every moment shared between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Yet neither of them seemed ready to put those feelings into words. Instead, they spoke through actions, their gazes lingering a bit longer, their touches lingering with a new depth. But in the silence of their unspoken connection, something more crucial loomed. Ken knew that despite the warmth that had bloomed between them, the reality of their situation had not changed. They were still stranded on an alien planet, and there was still the pressing matter of getting the Star Weaver back into working condition. Reena had been unusually quiet, her gaze often distant as they worked together. Yet every time Ken looked at her, he saw the same fire burning behind her eyes. A fire that wasn't just about protecting her people, it was about the weight of the choice she would soon face. On the 5th night after the trial, the forest seemed to hum louder, the tension palpable in the cool night air. Reena approached Ken by the Star Weaver, the light of the bioluminescent trees casting long shadows on her skin. She was beautiful, but it was the darkness in her eyes that caught Ken's attention tonight. "I need to speak with you," Reena said, her voice firm yet weary, as though carrying the weight of something unspoken. Ken felt his heart skip a beat, sensing the seriousness of her tone. He nodded, his stomach nodding in anticipation of whatever decision was looming. He followed her as she led him to a quiet grove just outside the ship's crash site. The trees there towering above them like silent witnesses to their conversation. Reena stopped, her posture tense, the shadows of the forest dancing around her. "Ken," she began, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. "I've been thinking about what comes next. About you. About us." Ken's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment he had been dreading and hoping for all at once. "You've passed all the trials," Reena continued, her voice calm but edged with something darker. "You've earned my trust, and the trust of my people. But the decision is not mine alone to make anymore." Ken frowned. "What do you mean?" His pulse quickened. Reena turned toward him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find something, an answer, an understanding. "Irza is a world of balance, of harmony. But the time has come for a choice that goes beyond your survival here." Ken stepped closer, his voice a quiet murmur. "What choice? What are you asking me?" "I can feel it, Ken," Reena said, her voice low. "The bond between us, it is not just about us anymore. It is about the planet, too. And now I must choose between you and my people." Her eyes shimmered with something deep and conflicted. "My people, who have been isolated from the outside world for so long. They are wary of you. They see you as an outsider, a foreigner. But you've become more than that to me. And the bond we share is powerful. But if I choose you, there will be consequences. There are those in my tribe who will not accept our union. They will see you as a threat." Ken's heart raced. He had known the risks. He had felt the distance between them ever since their first trial. The uncertainty that came with being from two worlds so fundamentally different. He'd known that eventually, Reena would have to face the burden of a decision. But hearing her speak it aloud, he could feel the weight of her words. The conflict, the tension, it hit him harder than he had expected. "And if you choose your people?" Ken asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reena's eyes hardened, her posture straightening as she took a breath. "Then I will have to sever the bond between us. Our connection would be forbidden. And I will lose what we've shared." Her gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, Ken saw the struggle in her eyes. "I fear that if I do that, I will lose myself. I will lose everything I've come to care about." The forest around them seemed to grow still, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Ken's heart pounded, his mind racing. He could feel the love between them, the undeniable connection they had forged through trials, danger, and shared moments of vulnerability. But now it was clear. Their bond was not just a matter of survival. It was about the future of this world, of Reena's people, and the delicate balance that kept Irza alive. "I don't want you to lose yourself, Reena," Ken said, his voice gentle but firm. He stepped forward, his hand brushing against hers. The warmth of her skin, the familiarity of her presence, grounded him. But I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to trust us. Trust me, we can find a way to make this work. I'm not here to hurt you or your people. I'm here to learn. To grow with you. To build something that's worth fighting for. Together. Reena's breath caught in her throat. And for a moment, Ken could see the walls she had carefully built around her heart beginning to crack. Her gaze softened, and the fire that had always burned in her eyes now flickered with something else. Something like hope. I want to believe that, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But I don't know how to reconcile everything that's happened. Everything I've been taught, my people, they are like family to me. And the forest. The forest has been our protector for centuries. I can't just turn my back on them. Ken took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their situation. He knew she was right. There was no simple solution. They couldn't simply sweep everything under the rug. The bond between them was real. But so were the fears of her people. The sacred history of Irza. There was no easy answer. But I know this, Ken said, his voice steady. Love doesn't have to tear us apart. It can be the thing that unites us. We can figure this out. Reena, I believe we can. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The glow of the forest flickered softly around them. The rhythmic pulse of the trees like a heartbeat that matched his own. Reena looked at him, and in her eyes, Ken saw the same uncertainty. The same desire. The same need for connection. It was there, burning brightly, and it was impossible to ignore. Reena's lips parted as if she were about to say something. But before she could, the sound of footsteps broke through the quiet. The air around them shifted, the energy of the forest swirling with sudden intensity. They both turned toward the sound, and Ken knew, without needing to be told, that this was no ordinary visitor. It was time for the final decision. The trial of her people was about to begin. The moment that followed Reena's decision felt like the world had shifted beneath Ken's feet. The weight of her choice hung in the air, palpable, but neither of them spoke the words out loud, not yet. The forest around them, which had once felt like an imposing, sentient entity, now seemed to hum with a softer rhythm, as if it, too, was awaiting what was to come. After a long, tense silence, Reena reached out, her hand finding Ken's with a gentleness that contrasted with the storm of emotions swirling inside her. I've made my decision, Ken, Reena said quietly, her voice thick with both relief and apprehension. I choose you. I choose us. I don't know what that means for Irza, for my people, but I know this. I cannot deny what I feel for you. Ken's heart surged, the words he had longed to hear finally breaking through the silence that had been between them. But even as the relief washed over him, he knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. The planet, the trials, Reena's people, they had all played a part in shaping their bond. But now, they would have to face the consequences of their choice. You're choosing the unknown, Ken said softly, his voice full of awe and fear, his fingers tightening around hers. And so am I, Reena nodded, her eyes searching his face, her expression both vulnerable and resolute. We don't know what awaits us. But I believe in us. I believe in you. She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. I believe in this. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Reena wasn't just choosing him, she was choosing to defy everything her people had known for centuries. She was choosing a future that was uncertain, risky, and dangerous. But most importantly, she was choosing a future with him. Ken could feel the weight of the decision pressing in on them. But in that moment, there was only the certainty of their connection. No matter what came next, no matter the trials or the doubts that might still linger in the shadows. They had crossed a threshold. Together, the Star Weaver had been repaired, patched up as best as possible with what limited resources they had. The last few days had been a whirlwind of activity. Ken had spent every moment working on the ship while Reena helped him with whatever she could, guiding him through Irza's unique resources. The repairs were far from perfect, but it was enough to get them to their next destination, enough to get them off Irza and into the unknown. The ship hummed softly as it powered up, its systems coming online, the familiar sounds of machinery filling the air. Ken had spent years working on ships, but this moment, the feeling of his ship, his home, coming to life, felt different. It wasn't just a machine he had fixed, it was a way out. It was freedom. He turned to Reena, standing at the hatch, her back lit by the soft glow of Irza's bioluminescent trees. She was still adjusting to the idea of space travel, of leaving everything she had ever known. She was strong, unyielding, but Ken could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the wariness of the unknown. "I don't know what to expect," Reena said softly, stepping forward. "The stars, they seem so far away. What if we don't fit in there? What if we're too different?" Ken smiled, reaching for her hand. "The stars may seem far away, but we're closer than we've ever been. And as for fitting in, well, maybe the universe needs a little bit of difference." Reena's lips quirked into a small smile, and for the first time, Ken saw the tension ease in her expression. She wasn't afraid of the stars anymore. She was afraid of leaving what she had known behind. But the love that had blossomed between them, that same bond that had made them stronger in ways they couldn't yet explain, was enough to bridge the gap. "We'll figure it out," Ken continued, his voice unwavering. Together, as the Star Weaver ascended into the sky, leaving Irza behind, the view through the viewport was breathtaking. Irza's surface, once a tangled web of bioluminescent trees and vibrant, alien landscapes, receded behind them, slowly becoming a speck in the vast expanse of space. Reena stood beside Ken, her hand still in his, her gaze fixed on the horizon as they breached the atmosphere. The stars were endless, stretching before them in a glittering sea of possibilities. For the first time, Irza seemed like a distant memory, a chapter of their lives that had shaped them, but no longer defined them. The ship jolted slightly as it entered the deep vacuum of space. But Ken didn't flinch. He could feel the hum of the ship beneath him, steady and powerful, and most of all, he could feel Reena beside him, her warmth, her energy, her heart. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered, his words almost lost in the hum of the ship's engines. Reena turned to him, her eyes glowing with a mixture of wonder and something deeper. "And neither are you," she whispered back, her voice full of certainty. For the first time, the vastness of space didn't feel so isolating. It didn't feel like an emptiness waiting to swallow them whole. No, it felt like a canvas, ready to be painted with their story. And that story, this journey they were about to take together, was far from over. Ken could feel their future unfolding before them, a path that would be filled with challenges, discoveries, and most of all, a love that knew no boundaries. The universe was vast, but in that moment, as he held Reena's hand, it felt like their love was the only thing that mattered. The stars outside stretched into infinity, and the Star Weaver soared toward the unknown, carrying them away from Irza and toward something greater. Ken knew that there would be obstacles ahead, more trials, more challenges, more questions, but there was one thing he was certain of: no matter where they went, no matter what they faced, their love would be the compass that guided them, and together, they would carve out their place among the stars. The stars had become their constant companions, a sea of brilliance that stretched endlessly before them. The Star Weaver soared through the cosmos, its bioluminescent markings glowing faintly in the darkness of space, as if the ship itself had become a living part of the universe. The hum of the engines, steady and rhythmic, was the heartbeat of their journey, a journey that had only just begun. Ken stood by the viewport, his eyes lost in the vastness of space, but his thoughts were far from the endless expanse outside. He thought of Reena, of the trials they had faced, and the decision she had made, choosing him, choosing their future together. It had been a difficult choice, one that had torn her heart between loyalty to her people and the undeniable bond they shared. But she had chosen them. She had chosen him. Turning, Ken's eyes found her. Reena stood near the cockpit, her gaze fixed on the holographic star map, her figure bathed in the soft glow of the console. There was something serene about her now, something that wasn't there before, an unspoken peace that seemed to fill the space between them. She had changed, but so had he. They had both come so far since that first fateful crash landing on Irza. Now, they were no longer just survivors, they were partners, bound by love and the promise of a future that neither of them could have imagined. And yet, here they were, together, about to face whatever the universe had in store for them. As the ship continued to glide through the stars, Ken approached Reena, his steps light but purposeful. She turned to him as he drew near, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his chest tighten. There was no longer any hesitation between them. No more doubts. They had both made the decision to move forward. Together, without looking back. "Reena," Ken said softly, his voice low with emotion. "You were right about one thing." She raised an eyebrow, a playful glint dancing in her eyes. Though she said nothing. "This is the beginning," he continued, his voice steady. "Not just for us, but for everything. Our future. It's not just ours to shape. It's the galaxy's. And no matter what happens, I know we're going to face it all, together." Reena's gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked away, as if searching for something in the stars outside. She was quiet for a long moment. But when she finally spoke, her voice was full of the same certainty Ken felt deep in his bones. "I used to think that Irza was the only place that mattered," she said, her words thoughtful, tinged with nostalgia. "It was home. It was all I knew. But now, I realize that home isn't just a place. It's us." She turned back to him, her eyes glowing with an intensity that spoke volumes. "And as long as I'm with you, I know that no matter where we go, we will always have a place to call home." Ken felt his heart swell, the love he felt for her more powerful than any force in the universe. He reached out, his hand finding hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in that familiar, comforting way. There were no more barriers between them, not the trials, not the planets that had separated them, not even the vast stretches of space. There was only them, and that was all that mattered. He pulled her closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then let's build that home together. Wherever we go, whatever we do, we'll do it side by side. Always." Reena's lips parted, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no walls. She reached up, her hands finding his face as she pressed her forehead gently against his. "I love you, Ken, and no matter what challenges lie ahead, I'll face them with you. Forever." Ken smiled, the words he'd been waiting to say slipping from his lips. "I love you, too, Reena, always, no matter what." The ship hummed beneath their feet as the stars stretched on, an endless horizon of possibilities. They stood there, two souls connected by the stars, the universe stretching before them like an open road. The Star Weaver drifted into the great unknown, its path lit by the light of distant stars and the fire of their love. There would be challenges ahead, that much was certain, but with each passing moment, with each journey they undertook, their bond grew stronger. Together, they were unstoppable. As the days passed, Ken and Reena continued their journey, charting a course through the galaxy, exploring new worlds, meeting new species, and discovering the vast wonders of the universe. They found themselves in places beyond their wildest imaginations, planets with vast oceans of bioluminescent algae, stars that burned brighter than any they had ever seen, and landscapes so alien they defied understanding. But through it all, they held on to each other. Their love became more than just an anchor in the storm. It became their greatest strength, a force that carried them through the trials, the danger, and the uncertainty. Each new world they discovered was a new chapter in their journey, a new opportunity to explore the infinite possibilities of the universe and their place within it. But even as they ventured further into the stars, their thoughts always returned to Irza, the planet where their journey had begun. It was the place that had shaped them, where their love had first taken root. They promised themselves that one day, they would return to Irza, to show the people there what love, understanding, and connection could truly mean. One evening, as the Star Weaver sailed through a quiet sector of space, Ken and Reena stood side by side in the observation deck, staring out into the infinite void. The stars shimmered before them like tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet sky. Reena leaned her head on Ken's shoulder, her eyes closing as she breathed in the peaceful silence. "It's strange," she murmured, "to think that we've come so far. From the trials, from the crash, from Irza." Ken smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "It feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? But we've done it. We've found our place, together." Reena's eyes opened, her gaze meeting his. She smiled softly, the stars reflecting in her eyes. "And we'll keep finding it, as long as we have each other." Ken's heart swelled with love, and he kissed her forehead softly, his voice filled with certainty. "Wherever we go, whatever we do, This love will be our constant. The galaxy may be vast, but it doesn't matter. You and I, we're bound by something far greater than the stars." Reena's smile deepened, and the ship's engines hummed softly as they drifted on through the cosmos. Together,